Hello and welcome to On Liberty, coming to you live from the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. I'm Glenn Fahey, your host for today's episode, filling in for our regular host Salvatore Babonis. I'm joined today by Melissa Monteiro, the CEO of the Community Migrant Resource Centre here in Sydney. Melissa, welcome to the CIS.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure, our pleasure. Melissa, can you, for our audience, can you tell us a little bit more about the Community Migrant Resource Centre that you lead?
Sure. The Community Migrant Resource Centre is a not-for-profit. It's a community-based organization, a charitable organization established in 1996. And we're a leader in the provision of specialized support services to newly arrived migrants and to refugees and to humanitarian entrants. We work within a community capacity building framework to encourage individuals and migrant communities to identify and address their own issues. Our core business is providing settlement to these newly arrived families and communities from various backgrounds. In addition to settlement, we provide youth services, children's services, employment and training, social enterprises, family support. More recently, in the last few years, we've also started to provide business support and business advice through a whole range of business advisors targeting multicultural businesses in Sydney. Lastly, we have a very strong multicultural support workers program that provides support to departments like the Department of Communities and Justice, who also train with us and provide cultural competency training. And we also provide consultancy and a whole other range of urban activation programs, Glenn.
Oh, there's such a wide range there. And can you tell us a bit about where the geographical footprint? Are you mostly in certain parts of the country?
We are a New South Wales-based organization, very large footprint in Western Sydney. About 4 years ago, we expanded to more northern Sydney regions, and right now we have offices at the Top Ryde Mall, and we service that whole region, including Hornsby, West Ryde, Eastwood, Epping, and for many years we've been very strong in the Hills area as well as in Cumberland, and our office is based in Parramatta. The majority of our clients come from the Parramatta region.
And Parramatta would be within Australia. I suspect that a huge success of the multicultural experience in Australia, because it is such a diverse and active community. What are the sorts of activities that you're engaged in Parramatta?
In Parramatta, like I said, we provide this whole suite of services that I've just mentioned to you, which ranges right from settlement, and we employ bilingual support workers from more than 15 backgrounds and bilingual various languages that we speak. We provide settlement information and referral. We've got thousands of clients that access our service every year under this program alone. We have employment and employment services, assisting migrants, humanitarian entrants, asylum seekers when they're new to the country. We provide services for them. We have a very strong early intervention program, that assists families with children 0 to 8 years and that are living in this Western Sydney region and Western Sydney part of Sydney. We provide assistance and playgroups. We've got over 11 playgroups in multiple schools here in Parramatta, including in Cumberland region. So when families are new, isolation is one of the biggest issues that we find, and women, especially women, access our services, and women find it difficult to make connections in the local community. Women find it hard to interact with mainstream women, and through the early intervention program, that's one way, a soft entry point that the organization uses to reach out to these women. And so it's women in schools, and schools are a great entry point again for us to engage with these communities.
I'm sure we'll come back to education through the conversation because that sounds like a really important inroad for communities. But if you think about the you mentioned a lot of the work being around humanitarian entrants, and it's in Australia in recent decades. Of course, there's been quite a number of distinct waves of countries of origin for a humanitarian entry. Of course, there's been the Syrian refugees, Afghanistan, and more recently Ukraine. What's the lessons and experiences that are drawn from those different entries over recent years?
Very true, that we as a Migrant Resource Centre have been part of all of these waves of migration that you've just listed, right from the Syrians to the Afghanis to the Ukrainians. Before the Syrians, we were very actively involved in the resettlement of the African communities. At the time of the Syrians, about 6 to 8 years ago, we know as an organization we were very involved in the resettlement of the Syrians. To this date, Glenn, about 5,000 Syrians have arrived and have lived between New South Wales and are living in Victoria. In New South Wales, they are more in Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney. We've helped them to settle with regard to their employment, provided employment services, youth services, children's services, and I'm really happy and pleased to say that the community, especially the Syrian community, are very well settled and are contributing to the economy, contributing to the community now. Recently, we've seen the big Syrian story was the repatriation and the rescue of the Syrian women and children from the ISIS camps there. And, they are now in Sydney as well. In August last year, we saw the Afghan situation unfold, and then again, the Afghans are now in between Sydney and also in other parts of Victoria and in Australia. Once again, they are housed here in Western Sydney, in Blacktown, in Auburn, in Parramatta, and the CMRC, along with a host of other organizations, are very instrumental in helping these communities, including the Afghan community, to resettle here in Sydney. And then again, when I talk about their resettlement, one of the key drivers and the most important aspect for any community to settle in Australia is finding a job. And that is what our services do. We're the frontline, we're the first organizations that help with the resettlement of these newly arrived communities. We bear in mind the torture, we bear in mind the trauma that they've gone through, especially the Afghan community that have so recently come here. We bear in mind the trauma, the traumatic backgrounds that they have been exposed to for very, very long time. And employment for them is one of the most important aspects we find for that help in their settlement. Housing, of course, housing and employment go hand in hand. You can't have any one without the other. And I think it's a whole suite of services that we and other settlement agencies, including the Settlement Services International, provide to the to the Afghan community. Like I mentioned previously, it was the Syrian community. There is a whole network of settlement services in the country as well as in Sydney. And we as settlement services are talking to each other all the time. The first points of arrival are with the Settlement Services International as an organization, after which referrals are then made to this whole consortium of settlement agencies across on the ground in New South Wales. And the Afghan communities, we have worked closely, and we have seen unfold a whole range of services through the Afghan associations themselves. The communities are on track, and the communities, I am pleased to say, are very well settling in western part of Sydney.
And in your view, do Australia, of course, does have, compared to many other countries, relatively high levels of immigration? Is Australia a place compared to other countries that is effective in resettlement?
I want to say, because as a person that has been actively involved in the settlement and the resettlement of humanitarian entrants and refugees for over 20 years now, this is my 22nd year. I'm really pleased to say, and happy to say, and proud to say that our government has done very, very effectively in helping the settlement of all of these hundreds and thousands of communities that are coming from overseas, and helping these refugees to lead a new life here in Australia, providing them with pathways to social cohesion as well as economic participation. Glenn, settlement is a two-way process for migrants and refugees, and helping them to adjust in their new life in Australia is what our organizations are all about. To helping them and welcoming them is what our core mission is as the Migrant Resource Centre. All people who migrate to Australia, whether they come by force or whether they come by choice, really it is a process of settlement. And that process is very, very critical. And we, as settlement agencies, I also talk on behalf of the Settlement Council of Australia today because I'm actively involved in the Settlement Council. We, as the Settlement Council, provide settlement to all these newly arrived refugee communities and humanitarian entrants. The process is very, very critical, and settlement needs arise over a lifetime. It's not just in the 1 to 5 years that the government expect communities to resettle, but settlement to me is a lifetime journey, and people can be in the country for 15 years and still be resettling. Sometimes trauma may take more than 5 years or 7 years, and we find that people take much longer to navigate themselves with the essential, the most immediate needs are like employment and housing. Maybe that can happen in the 1 to 5 years, but trauma and other aspects take much longer to settle. So settlement is also intergenerational, with children and young people born to migrant parents navigating and adjusting to between cultures themselves. So that is another whole area of resettlement. But I think that the government have done wonderfully in the last few years, especially with regard to responding to the Syrian crisis. And as you know, the government responded to the conflict in the Middle East, and Australia resettled in 2016-17. We first resettled 12,000, and then an additional 24,000 people, refugees, came in from Syria and Iraq. The cap has increased consistently over a period of time, and more recently we've seen in the Afghan crisis, again the government responding and opening up and getting a larger number of Afghans coming in again. And communities are very grateful. On the other hand, the Afghans in particular, there were many people left behind, and I know the Afghans tell us, because we are actively involved with the Afghan community, the Afghans are very mindful of the people that have been left behind. And so this is feedback that we get from the community.
So there are many, of course, as you've alluded to, there are many that are currently waiting in camps overseas, and many others who, of course, would maybe are disconnected with family members that are here. Do you think that there's a large demand still for more settlements, and is there the capacity here in Australia to work with a larger intake?
Yes, there is a huge demand across all of these countries that I've just alluded to, whether it is Syria or Afghanistan or more recently the Ukrainians. Yes, there is a huge demand and people wanting to come and resettle in our country, in Australia. And yes, to your second question, I do believe Australia is a very large country, a country that can afford to bring in many, many more hundreds and thousands, if not thousands, of people to our country. I believe also that we do have the capability and the capacity in settlement services to help in the resettlement of these communities once they're here in Australia. And finally, I want to just say that I think good settlement really requires that these refugee communities are able to independently navigate whether it is housing or whether it is employment or whether it is torture and trauma. And government should rely more on settlement services in the country and work closely with settlement services to facilitate this successful settlement of humanitarian entrants and refugees who have faced so much of trauma in their lives before they came to Australia. So Australia can open up and be even more generous to these communities. And yes, please bring them.
Just recently here at the CIS, we welcomed a school principal from a public school in southwestern Sydney in Liverpool, and a large portion of her school are made up of not only students from 90% of her students come from a non-English speaking background, but around a third come from a refugee background as well. And hers was an example of a success story in transitioning students to school and the routines and predictability of schools. Many, of course, have not been in formal schooling before. That's to me was a real success story in education. Do you have some other success stories in education that you might be able to share?
We have not just one story, but I can give you examples of our numbers in the education leading to employment in young people in Western Sydney under the Refugee Youth Transition Support Program that the CMRC, the Community Migrant Resource Centre, have run for the last 4 to 6 years. We have very successfully run this YTSP program and provided education leading to employment outcomes for over 1,100 young people from refugee backgrounds in Western Sydney again, in Parramatta, Blacktown, Auburn, Marylands. We work closely with the schools in the areas here in Western Sydney, and I can give you not just one example, but 1,100 outcomes that we have reported to the Department of Home Affairs on very successful education outcomes leading to employment with young people.
How do you handle the housing issue? You've touched on the fact that housing is a real challenge, and I mean there's a supply challenge in housing in all segments, whether it's whether we're talking about social housing, affordable housing more generally in the market. How do organisations like yours deal with and address some of those housing challenges?
Housing is a huge challenge, as you've said rightly, and it is one of our biggest areas in which we put a lot of emphasis on being able to get successful housing to a newly arrived refugee and humanitarian entrant, mainly because housing, as you know, if you don't have a roof over your head, it's impossible for you to settle down. And with the way that we're going in Sydney right now, in New South Wales, it's very hard. And one of the things that the government are trying very hard, and there is a push to move people to regional areas. In most of our programs now, we are partnering and supporting and working together with other settlement agencies in New South Wales, for example, like the Settlement Services International, and their work and stay program, where we are partnering with Work and Stay to help resettle newly arrived refugees from Sydney metro areas into regional areas. Really, we are trying to find affordable housing in out of Sydney, because in Sydney it is very hard. But what we're also doing is partnering with agencies and working together with other settlement agencies and the Department of Housing themselves in helping. I think this problem can only be solved with coordination, collaboration, and cooperation with other agencies. This is not a solution. You cannot find a solution by just working by yourself, because at the end of the day, the clients are going to fall through the cracks if we don't work together. And settlement agencies are working together. I know in Western Sydney, migrant resource centres are sharing knowledge and information and working closely with housing and with other interagencies, just trying to share resources with each other, sharing contacts with each other to enable more lasting outcomes for our clients on the ground.
Can I ask, is it always feasible to push regional? Because it would seem that there's one of the reasons for success in some of the operations you've described is because there may be a scale and a community that's a degree of density around the services available that are all closely available, and there might be other members of community that have settled earlier that help with some of that integration and support services. Is there a risk if it's a more regional housing option? Does that restrict the availability of services for some people?
I don't think it does, because right now there are a number of services that are very actively involved in resettlement of communities in regional areas. It is a well thought of program, and there are a whole suite of programs that are working as a collective in helping people to resettle there. Culture plays a very important role, and it's important that people are not just left without their cultural background and without cultural connections in those areas. And that is being taken care of as well, because people are not moving as individual families. There is a move to resettle communities of people in those areas. And can I just say, it is a matter of time. Today, it is a few families, a few hundred families. In a year or two, there will be more thousands and thousands families. So it's just a matter of time that this will happen and people will work together.
Melissa, you're also known for as being author of the book, The Girl from Mumbai. Can you tell us a bit about your personal journey as well?
Thank you so much. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I have had about 30 years of a background in community services, and I started very young at the age of 8. That was the time that I had my first exposure to the missionaries of charity, and I lived as a growing girl um, in Mumbai, in a suburb called Baikala, where the missionaries of charity were on the same road as where I lived. And Mother Teresa visited when I was a very young girl, and I remember just having that one-off meeting with Mother Teresa, and she did touch me and influence me at the time. I used to volunteer at the Missionaries of Charity as a young girl and go in to just help to feed the inmates at the time. And what really touched me and moved me as a young girl of 8 years old was that these people had nothing. They wore nothing. They had just plain, gowns, and they literally owned nothing. But the care that the nuns took for these people at the time was what moved me. And my father played a very big role also as a young girl. My father used to work with the Indian Navy and with the Catholic Relief Services after he retired. And he used to go to regional India, to a number of very poor states in India, in UP and Madhya Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh, where the Catholic Relief Services used to provide food, wheat, oil, rice, sugar, bulgur. to these very poor families. And my father, my father used to come back home every month after a trip, and he would tell me all about those stories about regional India, and they were life-changing stories for me. At the same time, I was exposed to the Salvation Army. Today, I am a Salvation Army ambassador, and on the street that I lived, 400 meters away, was the Salvation Army. And once again, I was influenced by the work of the Salvation Army, the work of the Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity, the work of my father, the Catholic Relief Services, and also seeing the disadvantage in the slum communities around the suburb where I lived. And that's when I decided to write a book, because last year I completed 20 years in Australia in working in this organization. But due to COVID, I wasn't able to celebrate in 2020. And I decided to write The Girl from Mumbai, which talks about issues around that are passionate to me, like women and children and disadvantage and poverty. But I also make a comparison between the rich and the wealthy in Mumbai, and the extreme poverty that exists as well, the housing problem, the prostitution. As a student, I was involved and had a placement for 1 year in an organization called Prerna that was providing support to children of prostitutes in the area. And once again, this was an eye opener for me. And so, in my book, The Girl from Mumbai, I talk about the last 30 years, my family, my faith, and the reasons why I am in community services and have completed 22 years in this job here at the Community Migrant Resource Centre. So I'd encourage all your listeners today to please purchase a copy of the book, The Girl from Mumbai. It's available on Amazon. It's an award-winning book in 14 different categories, including immigration. And so that's the story of my story in the book.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Not every day that we have a guest who has personally met Mother Teresa. What a wonderful story.
I even have a book that was signed and given to my grandfather, and my grandfather gave it to me. And so I have a copy of her signature, which I'm very proud to say that I have still over 30, 40 years with me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Melissa, thank you so much for your time here on Liberty.
Thank you for having me, Glenn.
And that was episode 103 of On Liberty. Join us again in a fortnight's time for our final episode of the year, where we're joined again by our regular host, Salvatore Babonis. In the meantime, I hope to see you here at CIS for our regular event series. And in the meantime, bye for now.